Hey, this is Derek. So I had a pretty good writing day, so I want to tell you about my work in progress, the book I'm working on right now, and then specifically about a chapter I wrote today, which I think is one of the best chapters of the book, which is mostly unplanned. It didn't go the way I thought it would go, but now I feel like it's one of my strongest chapters, and that's really exciting for me. And one of the reasons I think it's the best is because of all of the different kinds of conflict going on in the chapter. So I want to talk about, in this video, the three kinds of conflict that you should have in your fiction. So I made another video recently about the 6 kinds of weak writing. And in that, I said that one of the most important thing, basically, is that good writing isn't enough. It's not enough to be a good writer. You can write lots of pretty things and put sentences together well, but if readers don't care about what's happening in your story, they're going to stop reading. So you have to get them to care. And the way to get them to care is to focus on sympathy and vulnerability, which is getting readers to like your characters and care about what happens to them. And then also the conflict, having real stakes, having something to lose. Those are the 2 things that matter most for holding readers' attention. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about both of those, but mostly about conflict. So when people think of conflict, they think about the forces of the antagonist that are working against the protagonist. So these are external forces, and these don't have to be necessarily the antagonist troops or the direct antagonists of the book. It can be other little things. Your job as an author basically is to always thwart the characters. So whenever they decide they have to go from point A to point B, you put something in the way. And this could be a fight scene, a battle. It could be like bad guys, but it could be something really mundane or trivial. It could be, the shop is closed and they have to come back later, or there's a storm, or they have a flat tire. It can be anything kind of that's external that stops them from moving forward in the direction that they want. That's kind of plot. There's a quote, something like "Life is what happens when you're making other plans." That's kind of the same for fiction. When your protagonists make a plan, plot is what happens to them that stops them from getting the things that they want. But plot in itself isn't interesting if readers don't care about your characters, which is why you also have to introduce sympathy and vulnerability. And it's a little bit tricky to do. I was reading a first chapter of something recently that was good, and again, this is why it's difficult even if you're a good writer, because they were doing all the right things, but it still just didn't hook my attention, and it's hard to do in a first chapter, which is why I really focus on figure out how to write first chapters before you learn how to do anything else. But this is the way that it was going in this chapter. So the main heroine was rescuing somebody. This is a first chapter. They're already being chased by the bad guys. There's a lot of drama and violence and conflict. But then there was this freeze frame where, they've saved someone and they're trying to escape. But there was 3 or 4 pages of backstory where the character's kind of thinking, or the author's kind of telling readers about the world or the setup or the backstory or all these things. So it's she's frozen between escaping and being chased by the bad guys and rescuing this what do you call it, innocent, which is good because you want to show that your character, your protagonist, is brave, strong, and kind, immediately. Those 3 things, brave, strong, and kind. It's difficult to do in a first chapter. So it was a decent first chapter, but still there was a lot of freeze frame backstory while the author was trying to fill in all the blanks. And that's where it can get really tricky because it's a balance between, if readers don't care about your protagonist yet, they don't care about the violence or the action or the plot or anything else that's going on, the fight scenes. You want to hook their attention early on in the beginning. You want to make your characters likable, conflict and sympathy, those 2 things to hold the reader's attention, but you also have to move the story forward. And so plot for a fiction book is usually something changes or happens in every scene, every chapter especially, but I think every scene also, or scene 1 can be the build-up for the change that's going to happen in scene 2. That's basically how you keep your story moving forward. If something doesn't change or happen in every scene, you need to cut the scene. But also, in every scene, there should be conflict. So there should be 3 different kinds of conflict, I think, in most chapters or most scenes, or at least in your book often. And so this is kind of a really interesting topic, and I already wanted to make a video about this because I came up with the 3 kinds of conflict recently that I think are really important, but I'm writing this book, and this is the third book of a series. It's my first third book. So on the one hand, I know a lot more about writing fiction than I did when I started, which is kind of frustrating because this third book is going to be a lot better than the first couple books. And I hope people will, read the series and read the third book because I think it's going to be really good. But also, I only have a week left. This book has been on pre-order. I finished this for NaNoWriMo in November, but then I kind of took a month off and then I put it up on pre-order to force myself to finish it. And now I'm running out of time. So I have 7 days left and I have 7 more chapters. And I skipped a lot of stuff when I was writing the book. I got to my 50K in NaNoWriMo, but I skipped some stuff to get ahead, which means I should already be editing, but I'm still writing the book. And one of the really exciting things was that yesterday or this week, I didn't even know, if I'm going to get this done, if it's going to be any good, if I'm going to be able to pull it off. I haven't gotten to my final battle scenes or the final chapters yet. I haven't even written them yet. So that's kind of scary and terrifying. But today I had a really good writing day with a really good chapter that I think will be the best chapter of the book. And it was mostly unplanned. And I want to talk about why that chapter is going to be so good. And it's mostly because of the different kinds, the non-external types of conflicts that are in this chapter specifically, and why that's going to make this chapter so powerful. So there's a lot of backstory, but this is a young adult fantasy based on Greek mythology, and in this third book, mostly Egyptian mythology. So what's happened in the past, this series has 3 main antagonists, which are Zeus, Hera, and Athena of the Greek goddess. There was kind of a shift, and Zeus took over the world, and he only kept those gods and goddesses. The rest of them, they kind of went off into this other place where the Greek heroes have all kind of gathered, because Zeus is systematically purging the world of magic so that people can only come to magic through him. He's the only provider of magic. Previously, Zeus was sleeping with everybody, creating all of these half-breeds and heroes and monsters because he liked to create all this stuff. But now he has his forces who are just killing anybody with magic. They just execute. So those are the antagonists in this book, Zeus and Hera and Athena. They killed Athena in the last book, but my main protagonist, who's a descendant of the Fate, so she has the power to cut the threads of life. When they were killing Athena, when they were battling Athena, her main love interest, who's one of the Hounds of Hell, got fatally wounded, mortally injured. So he was going to die, and she accepted this little love spell, not a love spell. She accepted a little spell from Zeus. Even though Zeus is a bad guy, even though she doesn't trust him, she wanted to save her love interest. So she performed this little ritual to save his life. And she didn't really know how it worked, but it turns out later that she had bound her love interest's thread to Zeus's thread. So the main goal of this series is to defeat the antagonist Zeus. But now if she cuts Zeus's thread, she'll also kill her love interest. So that's kind of the main conflict of this book. And what they're trying to do, they've kind of figured out that this magic ritual that Zeus got, he learned from Isis, who's an Egyptian goddess. So they go to Egypt to try to they try to find Isis so that she can learn how to do this magic and hopefully reverse the spell to save her love interest. That's kind of the main conflict of this book. And so far in this book, there's been a lot of external conflict. So of the 3 kinds of conflict, there's been a lot of external. So already in Egypt, and they've only been in Egypt a day, they've already come across a mummy who they let out of an old sarcophagus. Then they had a giant crocodile when they were floating on the river Nile. And then there's a descendant of Cadmus who's pissed off that they killed Athena. So it's 3 different basically supernatural beings that they have to fight, but they're mini little battles. There's also a little scuffle with the local police just to kind of add some more conflict. So there's a lot of external conflict going on already. And that's really fun and exciting because, people like action scenes. So there's been a lot of that stuff and it's cool and I like all that stuff, but that doesn't deepen the emotional resonance of the story. So to make a book really matter, the background all matters because there's already a lot of conflict going on. But if you haven't read the first 2 books, or maybe you've forgotten because, there's been action scenes for the last 5 chapters or so, I really need to go back to the emotional stakes, why this matters, why it matters to the protagonist. I have to make my characters vulnerable. So I got to this chapter and I kind of skipped over it the first time because there isn't any external conflict. So if you're plotting out your book, I think it's pretty easy to skip over these chapters that aren't big battle scenes, or like there's not a lot going on. Basically, they get a clue from somebody. They have to go to Alexandria, and they get another clue to go somewhere else. That's what happens like in this chapter. And I didn't know how to, make a chapter where nothing really happens. All they're doing is like wandering around Alexandria, playing tourists, looking at the sights to get this clue to go to the next step. There's no emotional relevance there. There's no emotional conflict. There's no actual conflict. There's no conflict in the chapter, which makes it a bad chapter. So I was worried about how to fix this, but I knew today was the day that I got to this chapter and I have to actually write it because, like I said, I'm on a deadline. So I was excited because this chapter came together really well. And partly the reason that I think it's so strong is because I had to really focus on the other kinds of external conflict. So let me tell you really quickly what those three are, and then I'll show you how I'm doing them in this chapter. So the second kind of conflict is internal, and this will be your protagonist's fears or doubts or worries. There may be conflict between what they want and what they think they should have. I said earlier, I think in another video, that your protagonist should be oppressed, and that was kind of a cool thing. There's a cat walking by outside. I'm in a new apartment in Taiwan, and we have neighbors' cats who haven't quite friendlied up to us yet, but it's kind of nice just to see them walking around. So with internal conflict, this could also be she has a choice to make. She wants two things, and she's going to have to lose one of them. So she has to choose between two things. This could be like she has guilt about something she did in the past or frustration. So you want to think in terms of oppression, like there's some force that's keeping her from getting what she wants. Your protagonist can't have what they want, or they maybe don't even think they deserve to get what they want because there are internal and external forces moving against them, which is what I call oppression, which I think is a pretty good word for like a lot of the conflict that has to happen in a fictional story. And the third type of conflict I'm going to call lateral conflict, which I don't think is really the best word for it. I originally called it friendly fire or like side conflict, but basically it's other main characters who are allies of your protagonist. So friends and family, teammates. Often, like you'll see in TV tropes, there's that one asshole guy who's on the good guy side, but he's an asshole, and he probably betrays them and then redeems himself later. That kind of conflict is like friendly fire conflict. And they can fight, they can disagree, especially if it's like, she's fighting with her friends or she's fighting with someone that she cares about. It's more painful, emotional conflict. And they love each other. They're on the same side. They just have disagreements. They're different people. They have different opinions. Maybe they want different things that ultimately bring them in opposition with each other. And with side conflict or lateral conflict, I also think it can be the case where your other good guys have their own demons, their own problems they're dealing with. So if your love interest or best friend is sad or angry about something else, that's also good conflict. It's not direct, like your protagonist will feel bad because that's happening to someone they care about. So that's all kind of like side conflict or friendly fire conflict. So let me show you a bunch of ways that I'm using that in this chapter. And this was mostly accidental. Like I said, this was a chapter that I didn't exactly know what was going to happen. I just had to fill this space. And the nice part about having a chapter where nothing really happens is that that's when you put this stuff in, the internal conflict or the side conflict, because in an action scene, when they have real stuff to deal with, when they're like, fighting bad guys or running from the cops or whatever, they're not going to sit around and talk about their feelings. You don't want them to do that. They're not going to, think about the past or feel the regret or the guilt or the fear or like looking forward. They're going to be solving the problem. But it's really important to have this internal conflict and this side conflict on the page, because that's what makes the story matter to readers. If you're not showing the vulnerability and the emotional depth of your characters, then your readers won't care about your characters. So that's kind of what you need to be putting in, but you have to balance it between like the action scenes where stuff's happening and then the slower scenes where things aren't happening as much. And you want to deliberately put in conflict. So a lot of this stuff, like I'm not sure if I like added the conflict on purpose, but while I was developing this chapter, which I did today, I did a lot of research yesterday, last night, to kind of figure out what am I going to put in this chapter. And then today it all came together really well. So I'll talk about some of the things that are happening in this chapter, which aren't external conflict, but are really cool, and really are going to make the book much more powerful. So she's on this mission with 3 other people, and there's already a lot of emotional, weird, angsty stuff going on between them. A fallen angel who fell because of her, basically. So she feels a little bit guilty for him. The Hound of Hades, and they kind of like each other. She's kind of the one that he's the one that she's chosen to be with, and they have kind of a little bit of romantic history, but they can't really be together because she now, because of her feelings for him, she's thwarted her own efforts to defeat Zeus. So there's this weird thing where she saved his life without his permission, but tied him to Zeus. So now she can't defeat Zeus without killing him. So they like each other, but he feels guilty because like he's been fighting this war forever, and he's now the reason that she's not going to fulfill her destiny and kill the bad guy, because she's hesitating because of him. So that's a problem. Like, she had the chance to kill Zeus before and didn't, because she found out that Zeus had tied her love interest thread. So that's already going on. That's kind of the reason that they're on this mission. They're trying to figure out how to untangle things. And then also her best friend, she was getting involved with a different love interest who died. My protagonist, Kai, had to choose, like, her love interest and her best friend's love interest were dying, and she could only save one of them. So she kind of selfishly chose, the one she likes. So they've mostly, like, worked it out and forgiven each other already. By this point, they're mostly all friends on this quest together, but there's already a lot of, like, emotional underpinning stuff going on. And for most of the chapter, they're just kind of exploring Alexandria and looking for clues to find Isis. And the closest they get is in these catacombs, where they go down and they find all these old symbolisms of Isis, but it's mostly about, resurrection and the afterlife stuff, because it's a burial chamber. And she doesn't find what she's looking for. So even though I know, like, she's gonna find the clue to go to the next point, I was able to really focus on the frustration and showing what happens if she doesn't. What happens if this is the end of the line? And so this is kind of the way the conversation plays out. They go down this tomb. It's just her and her main love interest. And this is the last place they've checked. They've already explored all of Alexandria. This is like the last clue pointed them to this city. She doesn't know what she's going to do next. They're kind of on a timeline. Like, if this fails, she doesn't have another plan. And that means her love interest is going to have to die, because she needs to kill Zeus, and her love interest is connected. So this is kind of a scene where she says, like, why did you bring me here if you already knew there was nothing down here? And he says something like, the symbolism is not just about the people who die, it's about the people who are left behind. It's about, letting go, feeling peace, things like that. So they kind of have a little bit of a goodbye moment where she realizes he is trying to let her off the hook, where, like, he says, you tried your best, you tried to save me, we went on this mission, but we didn't find anything. You have to accept that you're going to have to kill Zeus anyway, even if it means, killing me. And she doesn't want to accept that because she loves him, but he's kind of like trying to prepare her in that way, and she's really against it. So they have, a touching moment where they kiss. It's probably the only kiss of, like, this book so far, because so far they've kind of been resisting their feelings because of this whole tangled backstory that's going on. But he's kind of like saying, you saved me already. I wouldn't have traded it for anything, but now you have to let me go. And she doesn't want to deal with that. So they have a kiss. He wipes her tear away. It's a really kind of touching scene. And it focuses on why all of this matters, why this quest matters, why unraveling the spell matters at all. So if I had just, like, pushed forward with, like, go to the next clue, solve the puzzle, I would lose all this emotional stuff that's really important. So as soon as that scene happens, which is a really emotional scene, they actually do find the next clue, and the quest continues, and they go in, and then in the next like several chapters, there's a lot more fight scenes, battle scenes, external conflict. But this is a really important chapter and scene, not only because it sets a lot of stuff up. I'm able to put in a lot of really cool symbolism and history and mythology that will become important later on in the story, but they're just like noticing it. So I'm kind of just planting seeds here. And the other thing you can do with the side conflict or the lateral conflict, for example, Isis is like a winged goddess basically. So we talk a little bit about that. And I can have my fallen angel be a little bit sad because he used to be able to fly, and he's a little bit like missing the fact that he used to have wings, which makes her feel guilty because she knows, he fell because of her and his wings burned away. So she kind of wonders if he misses her wings, his wings. So if you're planting seeds, if you can make it emotionally matter or emotionally relevant to any of your side characters, that's a really good way to make it stick a little bit more, not just to like mention something, but to make people wonder about the emotional impact of the thing you're mentioning. There's also a little bit of weirdness. I said how like she basically has two love interests, so the one love interest is kind of saying goodbye because he might need to die if there's a big battle and she has to kill Zeus. So he could kind of be like preparing the second love interest to take over, or say, something small or something nice, which would piss her off because she doesn't think, she can just be passed along to somebody else. There's probably also a little bit of rivalry between these two. They're two hot guys who like her. They come from really, like, they used to be complete enemies, but now they're kind of like hanging out together on this quest. They both care for her. Her best friend's kind of the third wheel who lost her love interest. There's a lot of like little things going on. It's not the main plot because it's not the story, because nothing's happening or changing, but showing this stuff, showing the emotional undercore of why all this stuff matters, not only to the story, but also just to make your readers care more about the characters. I'll mention really quickly what could happen if you were going to kill off a character. I said that like readers won't really care about what happens in the story later. If there's a big fight scene, if someone gets hurt, if somebody dies, readers aren't going to care unless you give them a chance to fall in love with your main characters. There are ways of creating sympathy earlier, other little things that could be happening. Little gestures of kindness, little like body movement, things that could happen. Normally if you're going to kill off a character, and I could do that, this is book 3 of a series, this would be a good time to kill one of my main characters. That's not really where I'm heading. I'll tell you something else in just a minute, but if you're going to kill someone off, you want it to be a really light, happy scene where they're confessing their emotions, they're having fun, they're like, usually show someone having like a period of peace, like they finally found peace, they finally make up, maybe they've been fighting and they have a real talk for the first time and they really open up and they really confess their feelings, have a night together or whatever. You kind of reach a new leveled peace or happiness where your main characters are okay basically, and then you kill one of them. That's kind of what has to happen because it makes the shock a lot bigger. That's a little similar to what I'm doing in this scene. I'm actually not going to kill off her love interest in this book. It's going to be worse than that. I'm going to do a really weird, not really weird, there's something I'm going to do in this book, which is the third book, which is authentic, based on Greek mythology, based on, Zeus's behavior. It's going to be a big shocking twist that I think my readers might hate, and I might get some negative reviews for it. But I like to stay true to the Greek mythology. And my books are pretty dark, so I'm hoping that it works out. But it's going to be a really gutting twist that's coming up a little bit later. So part of the way I can make that twist even more painful for my protagonist is to have this little, sweet, touching scene between the love interest at this point. So those were basically the 3 kinds of conflict: internal, external, and lateral or side conflict. Or friendly fire, whatever you want to call it. There's probably a better name. But I also wanted to introduce one other thing, because there's something else going on in this chapter, little pieces of conflict which don't really fit in those 3 categories. It's kind of foreshadowing, or at least part of it is foreshadowing, but there's also something else. So I don't really know how to define it or explain it yet, but let me tell you a little bit about it. Foreshadowing is basically, it's not conflict on the page, but you're reminding readers that bad things could happen or bad things might happen in the future. So one of the main attributes of my main character is that she can see when people are going to die, only if they have like a really sudden, brutal, violent death. And it hasn't really come up very much in this book. It was really critical in earlier books. This is the third book. She wears gloves most of the time, so she's not in contact with people all the time. And she can even say, like, when she's kissing her main love interest, she can even say, like, you can't die because I don't see anything, so we must find a solution. But one thing I've figured out to put in this book, earlier they stop for food. And let me go off on a side tangent because I think it's really interesting. Alexandria is one of the main foods of Alexandria is liver. They eat a lot of liver. They have like the specialty dish of Alexandria is liver. And interestingly, Isis, the goddess Isis, was the goddess who protected your liver. She's the goddess of the afterlife. She's the one who resurrects the dead, but she was specifically the guardian of the liver. So that's like a little cool mythological link that I can add while they're eating, lunch or whatever. And there can be a picture of Isis that they notice, because there's pictures of Isis everywhere in Egypt for the tourists and stuff. So it's something else they can notice, a little bit of a break. But in that scene, I'm going to have a little girl come and try to sell them a rose and touch her arm or something. And she's going to see that the girl drowns, which worries her, but it's not really immediate. Like, there's nothing she can do about it. She just sees like this girl's going to drown probably in the next, few months. So she might try to like warn the girl, don't stay away from the water, don't go in the water, or something like that. She feels a little bit bad, but it's not her responsibility. It's not the main thing. It's a little thing. It's going to become important because later, in the next, like a couple chapters later, Alexandria actually gets completely flooded because of the battle scene that she's involved in. So because of what she does, one of the effects is that Alexandria is destroyed, completely destroyed. This is book 3, so it gets a lot more apocalyptic. The stakes get a lot higher. So even though in this chapter there's not immediate violent death or fighting or anything, I can add some really strong foreshadowing that something bad is going to happen in the future. The other thing that I can add, besides specific foreshadowing like that have to do with the story, is introduce a little bit of history or stories or mythology which have emotional impact. So there's a lot of stuff in mythology, like this temple, and one of the stories of the temple was that, it was basically the story of the Seraphim, or the museum, or the Library of Alexandria, the lighthouse, all of this stuff. There's a lot of cool stuff in Alexandria and ancient history that's directly tied to Isis. Isis is basically the founder of all of this cool stuff. She was the symbol of the city. And so I get to talk about all that cool mythology and stuff, but I can talk about specific stories, historical stories, which aren't necessary for the plot, but bring up the right mood. So for example, a mad, frenzied mob destroyed the temple and slaughtered everybody inside. They burned the library. There's a lot of like penalties. The Romans came in and they, killed everybody, put their heads on spikes. I can paint scenes. I can talk about some of the history, which isn't the story. It's not the plot that's happening in the book, but just introducing some of those things kind of colors the scene. It gives kind of an indication of some of the bad stuff that could happen later. So if you have too much of a boring scene, just by telling a story, like a third party story about what could happen or what might happen. There's also a lot of stuff going on with Hera. So a lot of what's going on in this book, Hera is actually the main antagonist of this book, but so far she's completely off stage. They've never actually met Hera yet. They're going to meet her in the next chapter and have direct face-to-face conflict. But earlier in the book, I've been telling a bunch of stories where Hera does terrible things. Zeus is always seducing women and creating all these half-breeds, and Hera comes down to brutally kill all of his mistresses, all the mistresses' children. She ruins their lives, and sometimes not even like she kills them, but she tortures them, basically. So I've set all this stuff up where Hera is the antagonist. she does terrible things to Zeus's lovers. That's kind of the underpinning dark, violent background to the story that's going to become relevant when Hera actually gets on stage. So that's kind of a fourth kind of conflict, which is foreshadowing, what could happen, or telling stories about what has happened in the past. There's probably a really good way to put those together. Something like non-immediate or non-temporal, or referential conflict. I don't really have a good name for it, but that probably can be put together as in conflict that's not immediately happening. Internal, external, and lateral, they're all conflict that's actually happening on the page. So if you're telling historical stories, anecdotes, backstory, sometimes like the main characters are opening up to each other, or sharing like their personal backstory. Maybe they're like revealing things about themselves, or just like historical mythology, or foreshadowing things that might happen in the future. One other thing I forgot to mention, there could be a little something like earlier she was attacked by this serpent guy who was related to the sons of Cadmus. I don't know if you know the mythology of Cadmus, but basically he slew a water dragon, and then Athena told him to plant the teeth of the dragon, and they sprouted into the Spartoi, and then Cadmus threw a gemstone, and the Spartoi all killed each other until there were only 5 left. So this is like the 5 strongest Spartoi who are descendants of a dragon. Those are bad guys in my book because they're, warriors of Athena, and they want revenge for her killing Athena. So they come after her repeatedly and try to kill her. And so even though there's none of that in this chapter, she could be a little bit worried about that. She could see a picture of a dragon, or she could see, something like that, and think about them and wonder where they are, or if they're coming back, or if she's going to run into them again. Little things like that, which just remind readers that there's conflict out there, there's danger out there that could happen anytime. So it's kind of like looking forward or back and introducing conflict that's not immediately, but it could happen, or it has happened. So those are basically 4 different kinds of conflict. I hope this video has helped. Maybe you can get some new ideas about the book you're working on specifically. I do think it's really important. Let me go again through what I mentioned in the beginning, that you need to have sympathy and conflict for readers to care about what's happening in your story. And it's not all just about external conflict. Like, you want to have a lot of conflict, but it can be internal or lateral, or the other one, which is, looking forward or looking back. You can have different kinds of conflict, which also increase the sympathy. Like, if you have those kind of conflicts, those interior conflicts happening, you're just focusing on like the emotional state of mind of your main characters. Why does this stuff matter? Why does it matter what happens to them? Why does it matter if they win or lose this battle? Why do they have to achieve what they're trying to achieve? You have to remind them, like, before they go into this battle, before they're willing to risk their lives to solve this thing, what's at stake, what's at risk, what do they think about it, how do they feel about it? You want to make sure you focus on those things so that readers like your characters more, and so that they know why any of your stuff matters. Because if it's just action, if it's just stuff happening, if it's just information dumps, like if it's just plot and you don't have that emotional core, it's not going to matter to readers in the same way. And I think I mentioned earlier, good writing is not enough. It's not enough to write well or to have good sentences. It's not enough. I've read a lot of stuff recently when I look through sample chapters from writers, and there's nothing wrong with it. It's fine. It's good. That's not enough to satisfy readers. It has to be better than good. So you really have to focus on this stuff. So I really hope this video on the kinds of conflict helps in your fiction writing.